Okay, guys, so this is going to be a re-upload, and it's essentially a responding to your comments that I did. I invited Lowery over because he was in the comment section of a live that I did previous to this one, and I wanted to talk to him about like his stance in the live and kind of present my opinion. So he did oblige me and he came over. Unfortunately, there was like a snowstorm, and you guys know I live in the middle of nowhere. And so my reception just got wonky and we had to cut it short. But I thought that you guys would still probably enjoy the dialogue, so I put it up. And I think that it's really good too because he's become a rather controversial figure. And when he was in my chat, he was very contrary to what I was saying, and which is fine. Of course, everybody doesn't have to agree. But I do really like and appreciate that he was able to come up. And even though he didn't agree with me, we were able to have a peaceable conversation. And I think that just goes to show that, you know, after everything is said and done, we can work together in this space. I was actually talking with another YouTuber about that very thing, about just internal friction on YouTube and stuff like that, and how we can't accomplish anything if we're fighting amongst each other. So, it's best, even if we don't agree, even if we don't like everybody that's surrounding a person, that we at least try to work together. Like if we are about bettering Black people, we can all contribute to that in our unique way. So I thought it was just really positive to have somebody come on that disagreed with me. Can I talk? To have somebody come on that disagreed with me, and have it be a peaceable conversation. And I think that we should try to do that more. We should try to have dialogue with each other, even when we're not in agreement with each other, even if we don't, quote unquote, run with the same virtual group of people, and just attempt to find a middle ground, right? And that doesn't mean everybody has to conform to the other person's ideology, but it does mean that we can find somewhere in the middle where we are not just fighting with each other. And, at the end of the day, I think that's what's most important. So, what we were talking about essentially was if Black issues were unique to the Black community, or were they simply human conditions and we were putting a Black face on them. And I present my argument, and he presents where he's coming from. Hopefully, I'll be able to do a little bit more of this. I want to have just kind of bridging conversations with people. I think that would be dope. You know what I mean? I want to see, there's so many people that I personally appreciate. I'm not speaking of G. Lowery specifically, although that's no shade to him, but there are people that I have a history with, I should say, on YouTube that I personally appreciate as individuals. And all y'all don't get along with each other. So it's sometimes very awkward for me, kind of being able to see the good in a large group of people, but everybody in that group doesn't flex together. I would love to see us squash in 2020 a lot of our beefs and just try to find a common ground and really let bygones be bygones. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, we can't beat a dead horse forever, but we can come together. And I think that would be really powerful if you can imagine the impact that that would have, not just to content creators, but also just to, just to our community in general. That would like ripple out. And I think that would be really dope. But we'll see. We'll see what everybody does, but that's what I'm hoping for. So anyway, y'all know I can chat it up. Let's go ahead and get to the video. I just edited, well, I'm going to, I haven't done it yet. I'm just going to edit out some of the parts that were really bad. I don't know, because I couldn't really engage it the way I needed to. So I'm going to edit some of that out just to make it smooth, but it's not a complete conversation. That's a bit of forewarning. Okay, bye-bye. Hey, you guys. Well, you guys know I have so much free time on my hand this weekend because, like I was telling you guys last night about me having the house mostly to myself. So I figured, you guys know I go back through like whenever I do a live or anything like that, and I hope I'm not cutting out because y'all, I don't want to go downstairs. I just want to stay on my floor. But you guys know that every time I do a live, or whenever I put up a video, hi Damon. Every time I do a live or every time I put up a video, I always make sure that I go back and I read all the comments in the comment section of my lives. And I read all the comments that come on my channel, at least I try to. I think I probably miss very few. And so I just wanted to address some comments that were made several times over in my last video because I thought it actually would be just a good discussion to have in general because this does come up a lot. And I made some notes. So I'm going to be referencing my notes. And I also invited at least one of the people who was making comments over. I don't know if he's going to be available, but it would be great if he could come and like qualify his statements and we could have the discussion. But if not, I'm still going to address it all because I think that it's worth having this conversation. With regard to when we talk about Black issues, are we just talking about human issues and putting like a Black face on it? So in reality, is this not about being Black? Is it just about human issues and we're making it sound like they're Black issues? So let me say that obviously some things that go on in the Black community are universal. And even if everything that went on in our community was universal, which it's not, right? Some things are unique to our community. But even if they were, that doesn't mean that we can't speak about it from a Black perspective. So this is what I mean. Hi, Here for Truth. What I mean is, for example, the United States has had a lot of, well, not a lot, but it's had a civil revolution, right? So if I were teaching United States history, because we're Americans and we need to know the history of our country, and it helps us understand why our country is the way it is today. If I was teaching American history and somebody came up to me and said, well, why would you talk about, American history? This sounds like the same thing as world history to me. Other people have civil wars. Other people have revolutions. Other people have divisions among their people. Other people build railroads. Other countries do that. This sounds like a human thing, not an American thing. Well, we would say that's silly. Clearly, we study American history because we live in America, right? In that same way, we talk about Black issues not because nobody else has similar problems. If we talk about Black poverty, that's not to say that there aren't poor people of other groups. But we're not talking about poverty on a mass scale. We're talking about poverty within our community. It's sort of like if I want to talk about women getting raped and somebody goes, well, hey, men get raped. Hey, children get raped. It sounds like a human issue. Everybody gets raped. Okay, but that's not the topic. The topic is women getting raped, right? If I say in New Orleans, there's a problem with children getting enough food to eat. And somebody goes, well, in New York, children have food to eat. In New York, children don't have food to eat. In Asia, children don't have food to eat. In South America, children don't have food to eat. Okay, that's true. Sounds like a human problem. Okay, maybe, but we're talking about New Orleans. We're not talking about the whole world. So something that kept coming up, hi Hyphy, hi Zero the Infinite, hi Bilal, something that kept coming up was these sound like human issues. This sounds like things that go on in every community. That kept coming up in my last live. And I didn't see it because I wasn't reading the chat. I read the chat. Whenever I do lives like that, I try not to read the chat just because I lose my train of thought. But this, I'll probably open up a panel like for this live. But when I was looking back over the chat after the live was over, I saw some misbehavior in the chat, just insulting other YouTubers and things, which I don't like to go on my channel. So I had to like delete that stuff out. But then I also saw the repetitive comments about, well, everything you're talking about sounds like a human issue. Everything you're talking about seems to, go on in other communities. Hi, Black Introvert. I like the way you spelled introvert. I can't lie. That was like frustrating to me because as in all of the other examples I gave, a lot of things go on with all the people of the world, but that doesn't stop us from addressing micropopulations, right? I feel like whenever Black people try to talk about their issues, we are told, well, that happens to everybody. It's not special because you're Black. When the gays and the transsexuals and all them, when they want to talk about discrimination, nobody goes, you know what? Everybody gets discriminated against. Everybody has this. Nobody says that. But if we try to have a conversation about Black issues, it's like everybody has this problem. This is a human thing. It's not a Black thing. But outside of me being able to justify discussing micropopulations and that being okay and not having to address the whole world every time I talk about something, I also want to say that some things are unique to Black people. And specifically, I covered this in my video, Decolonize. That's the featured video, like when you come to my channel, that when we look throughout the world, in every country where there are people with Black skin or darker skin present, they are always in the same position that you find our people in the United States. And that is pushed to the bottom of the socioeconomic environment. Everywhere that you find people with a darker skin color on the planet, that is the case. So because I can go to Asia and see this, I can go to every continent and see this. I can go to Australia and see this. I can be in North America and see this. I can be in South America and see this. I can be in Africa and see this. The only place I probably don't see this is Antarctica, simply because there are no people there. I can go to Europe and see this. If I can go to every continent and see the same social dynamic with regard to people with dark skin, if I can go to multiple countries on every continent and see that same dynamic, then it becomes moot to make the argument. Oh, hi G. Lowery, I invited you up. Hold on, I'll put the link in the chat. Then it becomes moot to make the argument that it is a human issue. Well, G. Lowery, I would say that I didn't feel that I needed to state that because at the beginning of my video, I said we were reading about antebellum slavery, specifically conflicts between slaves. So the context of the work that we were reading, that the context of that work kind of spoke to the fact that we were talking about Black people specifically. Do you know what I'm saying? So I would have to argue that I did structure my argument that way because the whole conversation was clearly about Black people and our communal issues. So although I agree with you, we could transfer much, not all, but much of that dialogue to other microgroups, they weren't necessarily the focus of that discussion. Another comment that was made that I wanted to address is somebody was talking about the usurping of one authority to the usurping of one authority. Why do you name yourself things like this? Come on up here, but you know what? You got to stop with these names. Like,
those are my nicknames that people have given me on YouTube. So
right, I'll just call you G. But did you see what I was saying about, I will agree with you that you can transpose a lot of these narratives to other microgroups, but that doesn't, invalidate having discussions that hone in on individual groups. And we could apply that to any conversation we were having. I don't know how long you were here. I said we could apply that to war. We could apply that to, hunger. We could apply that to child welfare. We could apply that to rape. We can apply this, it's a human problem thing, to any conversation. But obviously we do have conversations about individual groups in isolation with the understanding that it is possible that other people could be having the same problem.
yeah, I hear you. I, I think you were probably on that video, probably like 30, 40 minutes before I actually started bumping my gums in the chat box. So I probably missed some stuff. But the vibe I got was, even though you were reading something about relating some stuff going on in antebellum slavery to issues you see popping off today, and I'm not saying that stuff was invalid, but from what I heard and how you were structuring your argument, it just sounded like, man, you can easily just apply this to any other person out there. I'm trying to remember specifically what you said, but honestly, I can't. I have to go back and rewatch the video. But the stuff that I did hear that I'm trying to recall was just like, that could just be applied to so many different groups, at least in the way that you were describing it. So
Yeah, and I would agree with that, right? I definitely think that there's like validity to that. But I also feel like this. Whilst we could apply that to many different groups, the effect of those things, hi O'Shea, the effect of those things will be different in impact depending on the community. So for example, let's use something really egregious. Let's use rape, right?
yeah.
So we know that any human being can be raped, right? Anybody can be.
True.
But we would say that we would focus on the most vulnerable populations, or the populations that are most at risk for being in a position, despite the fact that we know this egregious thing can happen to anybody, right? So we might look at children, we might look at women. And although you could take those solutions or those conversations and apply them elsewhere, we focus typically on the populations that need it the most. So then my argument was that both in the United States and abroad, the repetitive narrative that we see is that people with darker skin, which I would call them Black, but a lot of people would argue a lot of these populations are not Black because they're not like from Africa per se, but they have Black skin, they have dark skin. We see that this is repeated with Native populations and Black populations throughout the world. So then I could make an argument that we need to have these conversations in isolation about these groups, or even more pared down, just looking at American Blacks like we did today. because we have to recognize why we are engaging in this, because we really do have to better our collective positioning. Would you agree with that? Our collective positioning needs
Uh,
to be bettered?
Somewhat. So some of the stuff is coming back. So you use this example of rape. So rape is not a very wide open catch-all type of phrase. You know, it's a very specific action that can happen to anybody, of course. But even within that specific action, we know that more than likely there are more women getting sexually violated like that as opposed to men, or at least that's what the documentation out there probably says, because somebody could put up the argument, well, there are probably equal numbers of men who get violated, but they just don't report anything due to the way society is structured. So that's a very specific thing. So one thing that I'm starting to recall now from what you were saying earlier, you were making an argument saying that something along the lines of, why do we go around here bragging about we make this amount of money, we live in this type of house, we got this type of education, we're trying to compare ourselves against other black people in order to try to justify how close to whiteness we are. And I was just like, that seems like, to me, that's a very broad thing, because you can go into any culture around the world, probably since the beginning of time when society started forming, there's always going to be some structure of people bragging about what they got, how much they got compared to somebody else, and then how much they got, how they can use that against somebody else to try to take advantage of people here. I mean, you can go all the way back to feudalism in Europe when we started having, kings and queens and peasants all over the place. So to me, when you were talking, you didn't, from what I heard, you weren't giving, or at least the part I came in on, I'll put it that way, you weren't giving any real defined examples along the lines of rape. To me, I just heard a bunch of general sweeping statements. So my thing is, if you want to focus on something that particularly affects black people, let's take something like out of wedlock birth. As out of, but at least here in America, we know it's like 70+%, probably like the highest demographic in the entire country. I think the Hispanics are starting to catch up a little more. That will be something that is more clearly defined to be more, in my opinion, more problematic. Or another example you can give is illiteracy rates. You go, especially you live in California, you should know this. Illiteracy amongst black people, black students, is like horrible out in that state, to where, from what I hear, the average black kid is reading like what, 2 or 3 grade levels behind where they're supposed to be, even though everybody has illiteracy rates. But to me, that is something that is, you're right over there. You're moving. You're getting robbed. You okay? What's going on? All kind
No,
of sound.
I was
The
going
white
down
man
a
coming to
floor.
get you? Like, what's going on over there? Okay.
No, I was going down a floor because
Oh.
sometimes it gets choppy when I'm on the top floor of my house,
Oh.
especially if the weather isn't the best. But this is what I will say. So, for example, using the example you said, what I
Yeah.
was doing was I was reading from a book that won a ton of awards, right?
Yeah.
Because it looked at slavery from a different perspective. And I was kind of irritated because Harvard obviously had picked up on the book because the author is pretty well known. And I was reading a discussion and an interview with the author, and I was bringing the book to the forefront and asking a question. And the question that I posed was, is there validity to the connections that are being made in this book about the idealistic impression that Black people are very unified, right? And that in slavery, we were super unified, and now we're just all broken apart and falling apart? Or is it a fact that the same sort of divisions and issues that we have in the Black community today were present in antebellum slavery? Asking as we read this, do we see any grains of truth of this in 2020? And so the author is
Yeah.
the author was the one that was quoting the climate of what was going on with the slaves and using slave narrative quotes to justify his positioning. And so I would read it and I would say, okay, so something that was present, right, in the text that we read was that because of their positioning, because you missed the intro of the book, because of their positioning, there was a situation where we had a bunch of people brought in from, right now we unify because we have black skin, right? But back then, being black is not special in a place where everybody is black, like Africa. So you had people from different places coming together and they did have conflict. And in their subjugated position, they tried to elevate themselves to have some sort of like pride about themselves. And the way they did that was by drawing lines and determinations of who was better than who, like a caste system within slavery. And I was addressing the different points the author was trying to qualify with regard to what those caste systems were. And one of those things was the proximity to whiteness as it was expressed with being being pulled out as a minority for a better positioning. So whether that be a better job on the plantation, whether that be somebody paid more money for you, whether that be you were given special privileges, whatever that was. And then because you got those things, your social status was considered higher and you thought yourself better. Now, yes, we could say that about anybody, like anybody who has money, whatever the case. But my focus isn't everybody, right? My focus is Black people. So I was asking, is it a common narrative in the Black community that when we see a celebrity, that when we see somebody who has money, somebody that the media is upholding, minding that we don't have control over media, right? So that's white people lifting them up because that's who controls our entertainment and our media. When we find somebody that has what I call a token position at a corporation, so maybe it's got so many employees, but a small percentage of those are Black, then that is the equivalent. I was asking, is that the equivalent of what the slaves did in their proximity to privilege and being in a better positioning than most of the other slaves? They felt themselves better. So when we find ourselves in a better position than most other Black people, do we then elevate ourselves, right? And also not just the people who elevate themselves, but those who have not been elevated. Is there a disdain for those that are elevated? Is there a distrust for those that are elevated? Is there a beef between those two sectors? And can we find that to be true in our community now? And I think, yes, you could apply that to other communities, but we're only focused on us because we are the ones globally who are the most oppressed. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and now when you put it that way, I don't totally disagree with what you're saying. I mean, you can always pull parallels from the past and see that stuff replaying itself in the present. Like I went to Tuskegee University. School started by Booker T. Washington, so he has this book out there called Up from Slavery. I suggest you guys go read it. It talks about how he started the whole school. In this passage, Booker T. Washington is talking about how back in the day, probably like the late 1800s, right before the turn of the century, how there were quote unquote Pookies and Ray Rays back in his day. Meaning, he tells this one story where he was like, there would be dudes making like $4 a week, Black dudes making like $4 a week. They would take half their money, $2 a week, literally go rent a horse and carriage and just ride up and down Main Street just to be seen. And so we could think of that as the modern day quote unquote Pookie and Ray Ray who just rides up and down the block in his box Chevy sitting on 24s just wanting to be seen. So you always going to have those elements from back in the day that repeat themselves and play themselves out in the present day. And so I get that narrative and also understand what you're saying about this whole being compared to whiteness, or not compared to whiteness, but what was the word you used? I guess how close you are to whiteness
Yeah,
in slavery in terms of gaining benefits and privileges. That was probably a real thing back then too. And to a degree, you can say that's a real thing now. I think one of the issues with that argument is, like I said, I don't totally disagree with it, but back in antebellum slavery, I think that was more of there's probably some jealousy in there, but that was just, in my opinion, that was just more so of how society was structured and how they purposely went out there to separate lights versus darks, house slaves versus field slaves. And depending upon where you are, you may have gotten access to more little bit better resources than somebody in the field. I mean, you may have eaten a little bit better, or you may have gotten some hand-me-downs, some master's clothes, or whatever the case may be. And some of the field slaves may have taken that as a little bit jealousy and see you trying to kiss up the master when really, you're in the house probably getting treated just the same because at the end of the day, everybody's still a slave on the plantation, but they're not getting the hand-me-downs or they're not getting the extra butter, the butter biscuits we all like to talk about. They're not getting the extra butter biscuits because you're in the house actually whipping this stuff up for massa and all them. You fast forward all the way to the 20th century and you start comparing the educated lames versus Pookie and Ray Ray and all these rich athletes and rappers we got and how they like to floss and stunt. There's still that old school antebellum slavery thing. You trying to, you think you better than us, especially if you got more money, or you think you all that because the white man gave this to you. There's still hints of that, and there will always be Negroes out there, and we're all guilty of this, to include myself and everybody in the chat in some form of fashion, where we compare ourselves up against other Black people who have less than us. But my biggest gripe with that argument is that back in the day, those groups were separated by force, meaning if you got thrown in the field doing some outdoor manual labor, or you were thrown in the house, it's not like you can, go up to massa and ask for a transfer. Can I be moved to the field or can I be moved to the house? You were kind of stuck where you're at. Today, you have opportunities and options to where you can do things to try to elevate your lifestyle and or earning potential to where, hopefully you can move up. But even if you do that, there's still going to be that hint of, well, I'm better than this person over here, and it's a whole bunch of reasons as to why that goes into play. So, but I guess you can call that a relic that's been passed on, where we're constantly comparing ourselves, and maybe that's another one of those indirect effects of white supremacy and all that other stuff everybody likes to talk about. Still there? Hello? Where'd she go? Still there, Irene? Irene. Well, guess it's the G Lowery show now. So what's going on, people? I don't know where Irene went. So what y'all want to talk about? I don't took over her channel. So y'all go sub to my channel. We're over there, talking about things.